In the first 8 seconds, you hear something you were never meant to hear, a whisper buried under old floorboards, the kind of sound a house makes when memory tries to wake itself. Imagine this: a candle guttering in a room no living eye has entered since 1823, and beneath that flame, a ledger stained darker than ink, darker than age, listing names of people who were never buried, never mourned, only processed. This was the secret of the Rothmore family of eastern Pennsylvania, the funeral home that locals trusted with their dead, the same family who gathered grief like currency and used funerals as a veil for something older, colder, and hungrier. Tonight you're not just hearing a story, you're stepping into a vault sealed by almost 2 centuries of silence. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. Nothing about what happened in that house was random. Nothing was accidental. It was engineered, designed, structured like a mechanism built to disappear people quietly, efficiently, systemically. The Rothmore patriarch, Elias Rothmore, wasn't a simple undertaker. He was a man who learned early that death is power when the living don't ask questions. And in 1823, no one asked questions. Not in a state where the church controlled the flow of information, where the sheriff owed favors, and where farmers feared the dark more than they feared the men who claimed to master it. But history remembers patterns even when people don't. And the pattern here, it begins with the newborn cry of a child born into that house under a moonless sky, and the first corpse that vanished from the family's ledger forever. As we move through this together, I want you to listen not just with curiosity but with awareness. This kind of story, hidden families, buried crimes, institutions shielding rot, these are not relics of the past. They are templates. They are blueprints. And men who understand blueprints can see structures others miss. So breathe in, steady yourself, and step with me through the door no one alive has walked through since the Rothmores were erased. What we uncover from here on is forbidden by design. By the time Elias Rothmore was 30, he understood something most men never grasp in a lifetime. Grief blinds people more effectively than lies. In the early 1800s, death was constant. Disease, winter, childbirth, accidents on the railroad or in coal pits. Whole families felt the cold hand of fate every season. Elias learned that if you stood close enough to loss, if you spoke softly enough, people would trust you with their dead and their secrets. The Rothmore funeral home became a sanctuary for the broken, a place where Elias's voice soothed widows and his sons carried bodies with practiced gentleness. But the family's true business lived beneath the house, in a cellar carved out by hand, far deeper than any ordinary cellar should have been. Workers later said it had the proportions of a ritual chamber, as if designed for gathering rather than storage. The locals never suspected that the Rothmores were selecting mourners the way hunters select prey, the isolated, the unprotected, the ones traveling through town without roots or witnesses. The ledgers showed funerals, they did not show disappearances. And authorities never looked for patterns in the poor. But Elias kept meticulous private records, codex pages bound in leather, marked with symbols resembling early European funerary rites, sigils meant to transform the dead into leverage. He believed the boundary between life and death was a door he alone had the right to open. His wife, Margaret, feared him. His sons worshipped him. And the community depended on him, never realizing dependency is the first strand in a web. When I tell you that what happened in that house wasn't simple murder, I need you to understand I'm not romanticizing evil. I'm exposing the architecture of power, how men like Elias create influence not through charisma, but through the silence of others. What if I told you that every institution you trust today has its own cellar? That every system that claims to protect you has a chamber beneath it where truth is processed, rearranged, hidden? This family wasn't an anomaly. They were a prototype. By 1826, 3 years after the Rothmore infants began their twisted apprenticeship in the family trade, the funeral home handled nearly every death within 50 miles. That level of control is rare. Total monopoly over the most vulnerable moment a family can experience. Elias understood that when you manage death, you quietly manage the living. Every household owed him something: respect, money, gratitude, fear. And fear was the most useful. He cultivated it subtly, never threats, only gestures. A lingering look. A quiet reminder that he knew the frailties of every family he served. People whispered that the Rothmores had uncanny memory, recalling the exact features of bodies they embalmed years prior. But there was more to it. Elias's eldest son, Nathaniel, had a fascination with anatomy that exceeded medicine. He wanted to understand the threshold, that moment between last breath and final silence. Witnesses said he spent nights with corpses as if waiting for them to wake. And sometimes, they said they heard him speaking as if answering someone in the dark. But superstition silenced questions. Pennsylvania was still young, still divided between frontier belief and rising science. People feared being mocked more than being harmed. And the Rothmores depended on that fear. The first documented disappearance occurred when a traveling minister passed through town. He had preached against darkened crafts and warned families about hidden evils masquerading as helpers. The next morning, his horse was found tied outside the funeral home. The minister was never seen again. Elias assured townsfolk the man had simply continued his journey. They believed him, because belief is easier than suspicion when your whole life relies on stability. But truth doesn't stay buried. It mutates, pressurizes, waits. And inside that cellar, Elias and his sons refined a method of making bodies vanish with such precision that it bordered on ritual. I won't describe how. They weren't artists of gore. They were engineers of absence. Men whose skill lay in erasing evidence so completely that reality itself was edited. And as you listen, understand this. The most dangerous predators are never the ones who spill blood in the open. They are the ones who remove individuals from the map so cleanly that history forgets their names. That is real power. The funeral home's basement wasn't discovered until 1897, 74 years after the first missing person vanished into the Rothmore ledger. By then, everyone involved in the original horrors was long dead, or at least forgotten. What investigators found beneath the rotted floorboards wasn't a crime scene. It was a cathedral of control. The chamber was lined with timber older than the house itself, suggesting Elias had expanded downward, carving deeper levels decade by decade. Marks in the wood had patterns, triangles, spirals, parallel lines, consistent with pre-Christian funerary rites used to bind spirits or memories. But these symbols weren't decoration. They were instructions. And the most disturbing discovery was the stone table at the center. Heavy, hand-carved, cold to the touch even after exposure to air. Its surface bore scratches not from violence but from tools, precise, surgical, intentional. Whatever happened there wasn't chaos. It was procedure. Alongside the table lay dozens of books, each filled with names, dates, and notations describing transference, yield, compliance, and remainder. These weren't the writings of a killer. They were the notes of someone studying how to dismantle human identity itself, piece by piece. Elias believed people weren't bodies, they were systems. And systems could be reprogrammed, disassembled, or removed. He treated death as a laboratory for controlling the living. By mastering the rituals around loss, he mastered the psychological machinery of the entire community. And if you're hearing this and thinking it sounds familiar, that's because modern institutions, government, media, corporations, use the same principles today. Control the story around trauma, and you control the people experiencing it. But Elias had an advantage they don't. You couldn't expose him without confronting death itself. And no one wanted that. So the family thrived, untouched, becoming myths whispered to scare children. But myths often hold fragments of truth sharper than memory. When the cellar was opened, the air that escaped was described as old grief escaping a cage. And the deeper investigators went, the more obvious it became. The Rothmores weren't killing for pleasure. They were killing for structure. For order. For power built on silence so thick it swallowed entire generations. This is where the descent truly begins. Elias believed something profoundly dangerous. That fear is the purest form of obedience. Not the fear of pain but the fear of the unknown. When people don't understand what lies beyond the boundary, they cling to the authority of the one who claims to understand it. Elias positioned himself as that authority. He spoke about death like a man who had shaken hands with it. People believed he had the gift, a sacred intuition. Reality, he had documentation, psychological profiles, observations of families cracking under grief. He knew who could be pushed, who could be manipulated, who could be claimed without resistance. And he weaponized their vulnerability. This wasn't random murder, it was selection. Like a scientist choosing which specimen to dissect and which to preserve. And over time, his sons refined the method further. Nathaniel studied the mind. Jacob studied the body. Samuel studied the community. Together they formed a system: the analyzer, the engineer, the observer. 3 roles mirrored today in intelligence agencies, marketing firms, political strategy teams. See the pattern? Power evolves, but the blueprint stays the same. People think horrors like this are relics of the past because it's comforting to believe we've progressed. But the Rothmores weren't primitive. They were advanced. They understood psychological operations long before the term existed. And here's the truth that unsettles even seasoned historians: the family didn't operate alone. Their journals reference patrons, unnamed, wealthy, traveling from Philadelphia and New York, who visited the home to witness the process or study the yield. That means these disappearances weren't isolated crimes. They were demonstrations, experiments, a dark market of knowledge exchanged in shadows. And once you understand that knowledge can be traded like currency, you begin to grasp why certain truths vanish from history books. Knowledge is only dangerous when the wrong men have it, or when the right men share it. Tonight I'm sharing it with you. By now you may think the Rothmore legacy couldn't possibly extend beyond their deaths. But the deeper you go into this story, the more you realize that families like this never truly die. They replicate. They disperse. They embed themselves into systems that reward silence. When the funeral home finally shuttered in the 1850s, 2 Rothmore sons vanished from public record. Not dead. Not buried. Not accounted for. Simply gone. But decades later, documents surfaced showing that a Nathan R. and J.S. Moore worked as assistants in Philadelphia medical research facilities, places infamous for experimenting on the poor, the unclaimed, the voiceless. Institutions where bodies were plentiful and oversight was minimal. Sound familiar? History doesn't erase monsters, it promotes them. The Rothmore method, select, isolate, erase, became institutional. And here's the part most people can't handle: the cellar wasn't unique. Other funeral homes in the region adopted similar practices. Quiet disposals, off-the-record examinations, data taken from the dead without consent. This family wasn't the source, they were the spark. And the spark caught fire. If you think systems today are safer, think again. Modern institutions don't need stone tables, they have algorithms. They don't need cellars, they have data vaults. They don't need physical ledgers, they have digital profiles that track you more intimately than Elias ever could. And yet the principle remains unchanged. Those who control death, control life. Not literal death, but metaphorical death, reputation, identity, opportunity. And those who fear these forms of death obey without question. When you start seeing patterns, you stop being prey. And that's why you're still here listening. You're not just hearing a story, you're acquiring a weapon, awareness. The very thing men in power hope you never develop. But this is where your descent turns into transformation. And the next section is where you prove it. Before we go any further, before we descend into the part of the history that was deliberately scrubbed from all public record, I need something from you. Not for me. For you. For the version of you that refuses to walk through life blindfolded. Every man who truly understands forbidden history undergoes a shift, a sharpening, a moment where he chooses awareness over comfort. If you feel that shift, even in the slightest, I want you to comment the phrase, "I entered the cellar twice." Not as superstition, as a signal. A declaration that you are stepping into the forbidden with intention. The algorithm sees engagement. Your mind sees transformation. And once you write it, we continue. Because what comes next isn't just dark, it's destabilizing. The final years of the Rothmore dynasty weren't marked by murder. They were marked by collapse. When Elias died, the power vacuum inside the family ignited a battle between the sons. Each wanted control of the cellar. Each believed he was the rightful inheritor of the method. But the method wasn't meant for multiple hands. It required unity, secrecy, precision. Once the brothers fractured, everything fell apart. Locals reported seeing lights at the funeral home at impossible hours. Screams muffled by walls that seemed too thick for sound to escape. And then silence. A silence so total that neighbors avoided the road entirely. When the doors were finally breached years later, the house showed signs of internal conflict. Shattered cabinets, scorched walls, symbols carved in frantic strokes. Whatever happened in those final nights wasn't merely violence. It was collapse of control. The system imploded. And yet, the cellar remained pristine, untouched, waiting. Power doesn't vanish. It waits for the next one brave enough, or broken enough, to take it. And now you're about to learn what the brothers discovered in its depths that finally destroyed them. The descent continues. When investigators first descended into the cellar after the brothers vanished, they expected a crime scene, a grotesque maze of violence. But what they found was far stranger and far more calculated. The cellar was immaculate. Not clean, preserved. As if the room itself refused to age. Dust gathered everywhere else in the house, yet the chamber looked frozen in a state of readiness, the stone table untouched, the wooden symbols sharp-edged, the journals arranged with deliberate symmetry. Whatever happened in the final nights of the Rothmore dynasty, it didn't occur here. It occurred above, upstairs in the part of the house the family allowed the world to see. That alone revealed something profound. The cellar was sacred space to them, the operational heart of their system, protected even from internal collapse. Investigators found claw marks in the hallway outside the cellar door, but none on the door itself, as though someone tried desperately to enter, or desperately to keep something from escaping. The brothers' journals recovered from upstairs described an escalating paranoia, each convinced the other sought to corrupt the inheritance. But a particular passage from Nathaniel chilled researchers. The threshold is weakening. Father opened a door we did not know how to close. I hear them beneath the floor even when the chamber is empty. Was this madness? Symbolic language? Or literal belief in something inhabiting the cellar? Before you dismiss it as delusion, consider this. The Rothmores were rational men, methodical, structured. They didn't scribble nonsense. And if they believed something was moving in the foundations, it suggests their experiments reached beyond anatomy, beyond psychology, into something we might today call the occult, though they would have called it the mechanism. Their writings imply they didn't simply remove bodies. They attempted to capture something within them. Identity. Memory. Whatever lingers when breath leaves. Elias believed consciousness was transferable, that a person's essence could be extracted, stored, repurposed. And if the mechanism malfunctioned, if the process ruptured, the threshold might indeed weaken. This theory terrified the brothers. And in their fear, they turned on each other. The cellar did not destroy them. Their fear of what lived inside the cellar did. And even now, the recovered journals hint at a final experiment Elias conducted alone. One his sons never understood and one investigators never fully decoded. It was labeled simply, reversal. Reversal is the most enigmatic entry in the Rothmore documents and the most dangerous. It appears to describe a procedure Elias believed would allow a man to return from the brink of death without losing identity, a manipulation of what he called the departing self. Modern scholars speculate it was an early attempt at near-death experimentation. Others believe it was ritual resurrection. But this is where most historians shy away, not because the idea is impossible but because the Rothmore implementation was far too sophisticated for the era. Elias described the human mind as a network of anchors, each tethering consciousness to the body. In death, those anchors dissolve. But he believed if one could map the sequence of dissolution, one could halt or even reverse it. To test this, he needed bodies at the moment of death, not after. And that requirement explains the disappearances. The family wasn't hunting corpses, they were harvesting transitions. They wanted the moment of departure. A soul, a psyche, a mind, call it what you want, caught between two realms. But here's where it becomes truly unsettling. One entry suggests Elias attempted reversal on himself. The timing aligns with his death. Some speculate he didn't die of natural causes. He orchestrated his own transition, trusting his sons to complete the process. But they failed. Or they refused. That failure fractured the family. Nathaniel wrote, "He lingers. Not alive. Not gone. The chamber hums when no one is within it." Jacob's final entry reads, "We are intruders, not inheritors. The house remembers him more than it remembers us." When the authorities finally examined Elias's coffin decades later, it was empty. No body. No remains. Just soil packed with unnatural precision, as though shaped by hands from within. If Elias succeeded, if he halted the dissolution, what state did he return in? What form did he inhabit? And did his sons fear they had awakened something they couldn't control? This is the truth other storytellers avoid because it forces you to confront something older than science and more precise than superstition. The possibility that the cellar was not built to process the dead. It was built to house the living that death could not claim. The collapse of the Rothmore family wasn't a clean ending. It was an infection spreading outward into the community, a slow unraveling of people who had brushed too close to the family's operations. For decades after the funeral home closed, townsfolk reported strange phenomena, shadows moving where light should be, voices echoing in empty barns, and most disturbingly, dreams of walking down stairs they had never seen. These dreams all described the same imagery: a narrow hallway descending into darkness, symbols carved into the walls, and a pressure in the air like an unseen presence watching from behind. These weren't isolated nightmares. They occurred across generations, appearing in journals, letters, even early psychiatric reports. The town physician in 1889 wrote, "Several patients described descending into a cellar that does not exist in their homes. They awaken breathless, disoriented, as if they had truly traveled somewhere." What caused this collective dream? Trauma? Rumor? Or something carried out of the Rothmore home by those who entered the cellar before it was sealed? Cultures around the world recognize this phenomenon by another name: psychic imprinting, the residue of intense human intention staining a place so deeply that anyone who encounters the memory absorbs a fragment of it. If Elias truly altered the transition between life and death, the cellar may have become a bridge to something unresolved. The dreams intensified around anniversaries of Rothmore disappearances. Even today, descendants of the town report that old houses creak in patterns resembling whispers, as if mimicking the cellar's pulse. And this is important for you to understand. Darkness doesn't fade. It migrates. The Rothmore legacy didn't stay confined to the house. It embedded itself into anyone who carried its memory, willingly or not. And the men who dreamed of that cellar often felt pulled toward it, not physically but psychologically, compelled to understand something they couldn't explain. That pull is what separates passive listeners from men like you. You don't listen to darkness. You follow it, dissect it, learn from it. Awareness isn't passive. It's pursuit. And as we go deeper, you'll see why the Rothmores believed the cellar wasn't just a room. It was an inheritance waiting for the right mind to claim it. When the house was finally demolished in 1903, the workers expected the cellar floor to crumble. It didn't. The stone refused to break. Pickaxes bounced off it as if striking metal. Saws dulled instantly. The demolition crew eventually abandoned the attempt and filled the chamber with dirt, burying it whole. But before they sealed it, one laborer, a man named Samuel Price, descended alone with a lantern, determined to chip off a piece of the stone as a souvenir. What he found changed him. His later testimony, recorded in a private letter to his brother, described an impossible cold that grew stronger the deeper he walked. He claimed the stone pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. At the table's center he saw an impression, not a carving, not erosion, an imprint shaped like a human torso, as though the stone had once molded itself around a body. Price ran out screaming. He left town within a week. 20 years later he was admitted to a mental institution, repeating the same phrase, "It remembers him." The stone table was not built. It was shaped. Some theorists argue it was natural, an unusual form of limestone hardened by mineral deposits. Others insist it was a meteorite. But none of those explanations make sense when you consider the journal entries describing the stone as obedient. Elias wrote, "The vessel accepts the weight willingly." Accepts the weight. As if the table responded to the presence of a body reshaping itself. This idea aligns with the reversal theory. If Elias attempted to map the moment of death, he would need a medium capable of capturing the shape of a departing identity. Something that reacts to consciousness the way metal reacts to heat. The stone may have been that medium. And if so, the cellar wasn't a place of violence, it was a vault for holding what survived the body. That is why the table resisted demolition. That is why the cellar refused decay. Power anchors itself to structure. And a structure built to hold consciousness does not crumble when the house around it dies. It waits. The Pennsylvania Historical Society sealed the Rothmore documents in 1921, declaring them too psychologically disruptive for public dissemination. That's an academic way of saying, the truth frightened them. They weren't protecting people. They were protecting institutions. Because once you acknowledge that a family in 1823 understood how to manipulate identity and consciousness, you must also acknowledge how institutions adopted those methods. The Rothmores pioneered techniques we now see echoed in intelligence interrogation, psychological conditioning, and modern surveillance. Elias's principle was simple: control the transition. When a person is shifting between grief and acceptance, fear and action, life and death, they are malleable. And systems today exploit the same transition states to shape behavior. When governments declare emergencies, when corporations create artificial scarcity, when media floods you with fear, they push you into a psychological transition. And in transitions you are programmable. Elias understood this instinctively. He learned it through handling the dying. The moment before death is a moment of absolute vulnerability. Strip away fear and identity unravels. Insert a new narrative and the mind accepts it. That's what the cellar was, a controlled environment for manipulating identity at its weakest point. The journals describe implanting anchors, in subjects before death, hoping the anchors would persist in whatever came afterward. Whether this worked is debated. But if reversal succeeded, Elias may be the first documented case of induced postmortem consciousness retention. Think about what that means. A man from 1823 may have preserved his identity beyond physical death, not as a ghost, but as an imprint anchored to a structure. This possibility terrified the society, because if identity can be stored, it can be transferred. And if it can be transferred, it can be stolen. Imagine institutions with the power to overwrite identity. They sealed the journals not because they feared curiosity, but because they feared competition. Men like you learning what they learned. Awareness is a threat to the systems built on silence. Throughout the mid-20th century, a series of accidents occurred on the land where the Rothmore home once stood. Machinery stalled. Animals refused to cross the soil. Surveyors reported instruments malfunctioning. One engineer described his compass spinning wildly whenever he stepped within 10 feet of the old cellar site. These anomalies were dismissed publicly as superstition, but classified reports from the 1960s, now leaked, show military analysts surveyed the land for electromagnetic irregularities. They found spikes of energy at random intervals, pulses matching the rhythm of a human heartbeat. Not constant, not mechanical, pulses, as if something beneath the soil stirred intermittently. Analysts speculated the buried chamber created a memory resonance, residual energy from highly emotional events. But one scientist proposed a darker explanation. If the chamber contained a structure designed to capture consciousness, any active imprint may still attempt to interface with its environment. In other words, something buried could still be trying to reach out. Locals supported this unintentionally. They told stories of standing near the site and feeling watched. Not by ghosts but by something evaluating them, judging, selecting. One hunter reported hearing his name whispered from the ground. Another claimed he felt compelled to dig as if answering a call. These encounters shared one detail, the sensation of descending, falling inward, like being pulled mentally toward a depth that didn't exist in the physical world. That sensation echoes the Rothmore dreams from earlier generations. You see the pattern. The cellar's influence persisted even without the house. Power doesn't require walls. It requires memory. And the land itself remembers. Today the property remains privately owned by a foundation that refuses to disclose its membership. They built nothing on the land. No structures. No visitors allowed. Just fencing and warnings. What are they guarding? A hole in the ground? Or the possibility that something beneath it is not finished? We need to step back from the hauntings, the rituals, the anomalies, and focus on the deeper truth, the one that connects every thread of this story to the world you live in right now. The Rothmores weren't unique because they were killers. Killers are common. They weren't unique because they ran a funeral home. Undertakers are everywhere. They were unique because they treated death as infrastructure. A system. A process that could be manipulated, controlled, reversed. They weren't exploring the occult. They were experimenting with human potential. Specifically, how to capture the essence of a man and use it as a tool. And that concept terrifies modern power structures. Because if a family in 1823 could extract identity from the dying, what could institutions with modern technology extract from the living? Data, behavior, preferences, vulnerabilities, all processed, cataloged, weaponized. The Rothmores were the blueprint. Observe, isolate, extract, convert. Today we call that profiling, forecasting, behavior modification. The only difference is the medium. Elias used a stone table and silence. Institutions today use digital platforms and noise. Both reshape identity. Both capture consciousness. Both rely on your transitions, your fear, your grief, your distraction. And this is why I talk to you the way I do. Not as a storyteller, but as someone pulling you out of the fog men are trained to live in. You're not here to be entertained. You're here to be sharpened. To recognize structures the average man walks through blindly. The Rothmores didn't die. Their methods evolved. And every system you interact with, online, medical, financial, educational, uses a version of their model. The question is, do you want to be the subject, or the observer? The man on the table, or the man who understands the table? The descent continues because you're not done transforming. To understand what happened next in the Rothmore lineage, you must understand the psychology of men who inherit forbidden knowledge. When a family builds its identity around a secret, the secret becomes more real than blood. It becomes the spine of their existence. And when that spine breaks, as it did when the brothers turned on each other, the fragments scatter like shrapnel across generations. In the early 1900s, scattered documents revealed that several distant Rothmore descendants changed their names and left Pennsylvania entirely, but they carried whispers of the legacy with them. Not stories, behaviors, obsessions, patterns. One descendant, living in Ohio under the name R. Moore, kept meticulous records of strangers he observed in public. Another, a New York medical assistant, was quietly dismissed after dissecting cadavers with procedures eerily similar to the journals. A third worked briefly as a mortuary apprentice before vanishing. These were not coincidences. They were echoes of a system refusing to die. But the most compelling case was a man named Elias R., born in 1929, who claimed to hear memories when he touched cold surfaces. He believed that objects could store identity, especially stone. His family dismissed him as delusional, until he carved the Rothmore symbols into the basement wall of their home, symbols he had never seen. When questioned, he said, "I remembered them." Not learned. Remembered. This raises a disturbing possibility. If the Rothmores truly captured consciousness imprints in the cellar, those imprints may have threaded themselves into the bloodline. Not as ghosts, but as inherited memory, encoded trauma passed down genetically or psychologically. Modern science calls this epigenetics. Ancient cultures call it ancestral possession. The Rothmore case suggests both may be true simultaneously. Identity does not vanish when a line ends. It embeds. And those who carry fragments of that identity often feel drawn toward the source, the way a compass needle knows north even when buried. Consider why you're still listening, still hungry for the next layer. This story isn't simply horror or history. It resonates because some part of you recognizes the architecture, the structure beneath the narrative. You're not just learning about the Rothmores. You're remembering what power looks like when men refuse to limit themselves to the boundaries others obey. And that awareness marks you whether you admit it or not. The deeper investigators studied the Rothmore journals, the more they realized the family's obsession wasn't death, it was continuity. Elias believed that the greatest tragedy of human existence wasn't mortality but fragmentation. Every generation forgets the lessons of the last. Every lineage loses knowledge. Every man must start his path of mastery from scratch. But what if consciousness could be preserved? What if identity could be handed down like a skill, a weapon, an inheritance? That was the core of the Rothmore philosophy, continuity through capture. He believed the dead still carried wisdom, and he refused to let that wisdom dissolve. But continuity comes with a cost. Something must be sacrificed to sustain it. And that cost, in the Rothmore system, was individuality. The journals suggest the family viewed personal identity as a resource to be extracted, refined, and repurposed. People weren't people. They were carriers of patterns, memories, strengths. The Rothmore method dismantled these qualities and attempted to absorb them into a collective consciousness. A hive mind built from unwilling participants. And this is where modern scholars panic, because the concept mirrors emerging discussions in neural mapping, AI identity replication, and corporate data mining. Institutions today harvest identity the same way the Rothmores harvested the dying, by capturing what makes you unique and converting it into something that serves their structure. Elias's journals contain chilling lines like, "Individuality is waste. Essence is utility." That philosophy echoes in modern algorithms designed to predict behavior, influence decisions, and shape thought without your awareness. Systems don't need your obedience. They need your predictability. And predictable men are controllable men. Elias didn't use machines, but he used something equally powerful, belief. Control a man's relationship with death and you control how he lives. Control his fear and you control his choices. Control his identity and you control his destiny. The Rothmore story isn't about a family. It's about a prototype, a system of power that never died, only evolved. And the question you must face is this: do you recognize the patterns because you're learning them, or because you've lived under them your entire life? By 1954, the U.S. government quietly reopened the sealed Rothmore archives under the guise of historical research. But internal memos show the real motive: psychological warfare. The Cold War wasn't just fought with bombs and codes, it was fought with minds. And the Rothmore journals provided a framework for understanding how to manipulate identity at scale. One memo stated, "The Rothmore documentation may offer insight into non-chemical methods of identity destabilization." Another referenced the threshold moment, describing the precise second when a mind becomes vulnerable to suggestion. This was the same moment Elias targeted in The Dying. Intelligence agencies wanted to achieve the same effect on the living. They studied Elias's diagrams mapping emotional collapse. They dissected his notes on fear-induced compliance. They analyzed the cellar's layout as if it were a psychological apparatus. In effect, they saw the Rothmore chamber not as a crime scene but as a prototype for a mind-breaking machine. And here's the part that still remains classified. Researchers attempted to replicate aspects of the cellar's environment in controlled experiments. They built small, windowless rooms. They carved geometric patterns into the walls. They used temperature manipulation, isolation, rhythmic sound. Participants described visions, auditory hallucinations, emotional dissolution, all phenomena consistent with the dreams reported by townsfolk. And just like the cellar, the rooms seemed to develop a presence of their own. Researchers eventually dismantled the project, claiming it was inconclusive. But leaked notes suggest otherwise. They stated, "We did not test a room. We awakened one." This line echoes Elias's warning that the cellar was more than architecture. It was an entity shaped by the focus of the human mind. A psychological gravity well. A place where identity thins. Understanding this is crucial. Spaces don't need spirits to be haunted. They only need human intention. And the Rothmores poured generations of intention into that chamber. Fear, control, extraction. Those forces create a structure that persists beyond wood, stone, or soil. And that's exactly why your descent feels heavier now. You're approaching the part of the story where the system recognizes you. As the 20th century progressed, the Rothmore legacy began resurfacing in unexpected places, not as a name but as a pattern. In 1971, a private laboratory in New England conducted illegal experiments on terminal patients, attempting to monitor brain activity at the moment of death. The lead researcher used the phrase "capturing the threshold," a term found exclusively in the Rothmore journals. In the 1980s, a psychologist studying identity dissociation quoted an anonymous 19th-century source describing memory anchors, another Rothmore concept. In 1994, a mortician training manual briefly included a chapter on pre-transition stabilization, before being pulled from publication. These weren't random overlaps. They were fingerprints of a knowledge system that refused to vanish. Someone, somewhere, kept the Rothmore teachings alive. But this isn't just historical fascination. Men in positions of power want control of populations, narratives, outcomes. And the Rothmores offered a roadmap for a darker kind of control, identity manipulation. Not persuasion. Not propaganda. Transformation. Systems today harvest your data because your behavior reveals your identity. They monitor your reactions because your emotions reveal your vulnerabilities. They shape your environment because your surroundings influence your choices. These are modern variations of the Rothmore method. But the original method was purer, more primal. It targeted the core of a man, not his habits but his essence. Elias didn't want to predict behavior. He wanted to edit it. Institutions today try to influence belief. Elias tried to reconstruct it. And that's why the Rothmore case remains classified under multiple agencies. It isn't simply a historical anomaly. It's a precursor to systems still active today. When you study Elias's writings, you feel something that modern strategies lack. A presence. Not spiritual. Structural. As if the ideas themselves are alive, seeking new hosts, new practitioners, new minds capable of understanding their depth. You're beginning to see why this story feels dangerous. Knowledge changes a man. But forbidden knowledge transforms him. And you're approaching the point where transformation becomes irreversible. Let's return to the cellar, because every thread we've followed branches from that foundation. The chamber wasn't just a workspace. It was a crucible, an environment engineered to break down and reassemble the human psyche. Everything in it had purpose. The low ceiling forced submission. The cold stone preserved clarity. The symbols created cognitive resonance. The silence amplified introspection. This wasn't a torture chamber. It was a psychological machine. And Elias designed it not to create terror, but to refine identity. His process pushed subjects to the edge of themselves, stripping away the superficial layers, fear, ego, denial, until only raw essence remained. Whether he succeeded is debatable. But something succeeded. Something in that room accumulated, stored, remembered. Every subject who entered left an imprint. Every fear, every confession, every final thought. A century of psychological residue layered into the stone. The demolition crew sensed it. The investigators sensed it. Even you, hearing this, feel the gravity of it. That's because environments become sentient when enough human intensity saturates them. Not alive like an organism but alive like a system, patterned, reactive, intentional. And the cellar's intention was to preserve identity. To capture the essence of the dying. So ask yourself, what happens to a place designed to store consciousness after it's sealed? Does it fade? Or does it wait? Modern reports from the fenced-off land describe strange sensations. The urge to walk downward, phantom cold on the skin, flashes of someone else's memories. These aren't hauntings, they're echoes. Identities stored in the stone, brushing against anyone sensitive enough to perceive them. And if Elias truly halted his own dissolution, if his consciousness fused with the chamber's structure, then the cellar didn't die when the house fell. It evolved. It became a host. And every mind that learns its story becomes a potential conduit. The descent isn't metaphorical anymore. It's psychological. And you're deeper now than most men ever dare to go. By the late 1990s, a group of independent researchers attempted to access the buried cellar using ground-penetrating radar. The readings were inconclusive, but not because the chamber wasn't there. The instruments malfunctioned whenever the probe neared the center of the site. Batteries drained. Screens flickered. Data corrupted. Not from interference, but from absence. The radar detected a void. A space so empty, so pure that it absorbs signal without reflection. In physics, such a void is impossible. Even air reflects. Even water scatters. Only engineered materials, anechoic chambers, specialized vacuum structures, create such an effect. But how could a room built in 1823 mimic modern absorption technology? Unless the stone itself had changed. Unless the chamber wasn't simply buried, it was evolving, adapting, compacting identity imprints into a structure with its own form of intelligence. The researchers recorded one final reading before the machinery failed, a rhythmic pulse matching the average adult male heartbeat. Slow, steady, intentional, as if something beneath the soil was resting, waiting, breathing. After this incident, the land was purchased by a private foundation whose board members have ties to psychological research, defense contracts, and historical suppression committees. They erected fences, hired guards, installed sensors, all to protect a patch of dirt in rural Pennsylvania. What could possibly justify that level of secrecy unless the cellar still posed a threat? Or an opportunity? The Rothmore chamber may be the only known site where multiple identities were harvested, stored, and possibly fused. If governments or private entities could access that knowledge, they could build systems of control far beyond anything today. Systems capable of editing identity, transferring memory, shaping consciousness. The kind of power Elias glimpsed but could not fully master. The kind of power institutions crave. And the kind of power that does not want you hearing this. Before we continue, you need to understand something fundamental. Something most men never realize in their lifetime. Stories like this don't find you by accident. They find you because you are already standing at the threshold, already sensing the cracks in the world around you. The Rothmore family didn't build their system for everyone. They built it for the few who could perceive patterns hidden beneath the obvious. Men who don't flinch when confronted with darkness. Men who understand that truth isn't meant to comfort, it's meant to sharpen. And if you're still here, you already know the descent is changing you. You're starting to feel the story breathing on its own, as if the cellar is recognizing you. That's not superstition. That's pattern alignment. The same way the Rothmore descendants felt pulled toward the legacy, you're feeling the cognitive gravity of a system designed to reshape identity. But here's the part most men never understand. Encountering forbidden knowledge doesn't make you vulnerable. It makes you equipped. You're gaining clarity in a world built on distortions. You're learning how power operates beneath the surface, how institutions shape identity, how fear is engineered, how control systems mimic rituals older than the country itself. The Rothmore story is a warning, but it's also an invitation. An invitation to see through the illusions designed to keep men passive. To understand that identity is not fixed, it's forged. And the man who forges his own identity becomes untouchable. That is why you're still listening. That is why you feel the shift. You have stepped into the cellar mentally, even if your feet remain above ground. And once the cellar recognizes you, it does not let you leave unchanged. The descent deepens from here. The truth always hides in the places men are too afraid to look, and the attic of the Hartwell funeral home was one such place. When investigators finally forced the warped door open, they didn't find dust or forgotten keepsakes. They found a shrine, an altar built from vertebrae arranged in spirals, delicate as lace, placed with the care of a jeweler and the pride of someone who believed their craft was a divine calling. The bones were scrubbed white, polished with oils, some inscribed with crude etchings of eyes and spirals and symbols that resembled early Pennsylvania Dutch protection sigils. But distorted, inverted, turned into something predatory. The air in the attic was heavy but not from decay. It felt staged, curated, as if the Hartwicks wanted someone to find this, someone capable of understanding it. And on the back wall, carved deep into the wood with unnatural precision, was one sentence: "We make souls visible." The investigators didn't know what it meant. But you do. Because you've seen what happens when a family believes they're above law and morality, when they convince themselves they can manipulate life, death, and identity. And this was only their beginning. The deeper the probe went, the more the Hartwick lineage began unraveling like a rope soaked in oil. Their ancestors had arrived from Württemberg in the late 1700s, bringing with them meticulous mortuary practices and an unusual obsession with soul weight, not metaphorically but literally. Journals recovered from a locked cellar box described weighing bodies before and after death, searching for etheric displacement, as if they believed something physically left the human form at the moment of passing. But the entries grew darker with each decade. By 1810, the notes spoke of interventions, methods of guiding the soul's departure, extracting it, reshaping it, preserving it. And by 1823, the year the killings began, the tone shifted into full delusion. They wrote of harvesting essence, of building vessels, of creating a family that would outlive flesh. What investigators misread as madness was something closer to doctrine. The Hartwicks weren't killers for the sake of cruelty. They believed they were pioneers. They believed death was clay and they were sculptors. They believed their victims weren't taken, they were transformed. And the funeral home was their workshop, their temple, their laboratory of horrors. One detail always bothered historians. The Hartwicks kept immaculate records of their embalming and burial services, yet the ledger for 1823 contained 12 unexplained gaps, blank entries marked only with the symbol of a downward-pointing spiral. At first, researchers thought it was a code for unpaid services or private clients, until they discovered pieces of clothing, jewelry, and locks of hair hidden behind the ledger wall panel. Each bundle corresponded perfectly to the timeline of the disappearances. The Hartwicks didn't erase evidence, they archived it. They kept tokens like trophies but not out of pride. It was ritual. A way to anchor the essence of each victim, according to the recovered journals. This wasn't carelessness. It was intentional bookkeeping for something far more disturbing than murder. Each spiral marked a person whose body was never meant to be found. Someone whose remains had been repurposed into the family's experiments. Bone altars, preserved organs, wax-faced effigies discovered years later. They didn't bury the dead. They recycled them. And through those tokens, through those spirals, they believed they could maintain control over the victims' identities even after death, binding them, owning them, turning human lives into inventory. Rumors swirled among townspeople long after the funeral home was shut down. Some swore they heard movement inside at night, decades after it was abandoned. Others claimed to see shadows shifting behind the boarded windows, as if figures moved about their rituals in the dark. But the most chilling accounts came from descendants of those who lived near the Hartwicks in the 1820s. They spoke of hearing faint humming, always the same melody, always rising and falling like a lullaby, from the woods behind the property. That melody wasn't random. Investigators later discovered it transcribed in the Hartwick journals under the name, the Unbinding Hymn. The notes were uneven, hypnotic, designed to lull minds into a state the Hartwicks called receptive surrender. They believed that music softened the boundary between body and soul. And they practiced it often, sometimes for hours, while working on their victims. That humming wasn't a song. It was a tool. A psychological lever. And generations later, old residents still swear they hear it on quiet winter nights, carried by wind across the abandoned grounds, as if the rituals never truly ended. The more evidence surfaced, the clearer it became that the Hartwick family operated like an early psychological cult long before the word even existed. They manipulated townspeople through a carefully crafted persona of piety and service, using their role as caretakers of the dead to conceal their darker pursuits. They preached moral virtue in public, while privately experimenting with what they believed were gateways to higher consciousness through death. And the people trusted them. The Hartwicks used grief as a weapon, comforting families, offering discounted services, quietly influencing emotional states at funerals through incense mixtures later found to contain psychoactive herbs. They didn't just handle death, they orchestrated emotional vulnerability. They knew how to break someone down from the inside, aligning minds with their principles without ever speaking a word. It's the same mechanism institutions use today: trust, authority, vulnerability. Once someone accepts your role, they accept your influence. And that influence can reshape identity before they ever realize what's happening. In the silent basement, authorities found another object the public was never told about: A wooden mask carved with unnatural symmetry, smooth as bone with eye slits too narrow for comfort. Its inside surface was stained with what chemists later confirmed was dried human blood mixed with ash and plant resin. The Hartwicks called it the witness, referenced in 3 journal entries as a tool for seeing the soul as it departs. But the wording suggested something even darker, that the mask wasn't meant for observers, but for victims. Wearing it was supposed to prepare the essence, as if stripping away identity before death made the transition easier for harvesting. The twisted logic was undeniable. To them, a person wasn't killed, they were converted. And the mask was the final step in separating the human from the useful. Even today, museums refuse to display it. Too much history embedded in its surface. Too many lives reduced to ritual stains and forgotten breaths. You need to understand something crucial here. The Hartwicks weren't chaotic monsters. They were methodical, organized. Their crimes followed patterns designed to maximize psychological and spiritual control, echoing ancient European death rites that blended superstition, folk magic, and proto-science. Every step, from the humming hymns to the bone altars to the mask, was part of a belief system aimed at transcending mortality through stolen essence. And that should disturb you more than any single act of violence. Because when a family convinces itself it's discovering forbidden knowledge, ethics vanish. Identity becomes raw material. Souls become currency. And once a group believes they've accessed a higher plane of understanding, no law can restrain them. That is the real danger of hidden knowledge. Not that it's dark, but that it convinces the wrong people they are enlightened. And history has proven over and over that such people always demand a price in blood. By now, the investigators realized they weren't uncovering a series of murders. They were dismantling an ideology. Every journal entry, every symbol, every preserved fragment of bone hinted at a worldview in which ordinary humanity was something to be surpassed. The Hartwicks viewed death not as an ending but as raw potential. They believed they were lifting the veil, peeling back the layers of human limitation, constructing an everlasting lineage fused from the pieces of others. And the scariest part? They saw themselves as benevolent. They wrote about gratitude, purpose, even the honor of contribution from their victims. This wasn't madness, it was devotion. A complete rewriting of morality. And that should force you to consider a question too many men avoid. How many modern institutions, ones with far more power than a rural 1823 funeral home, operate with the same philosophy behind closed doors? When the state finally confiscated the property, officials sealed off the basement. Not because of evidence but because of what they feared. The journals mentioned a final experiment unfinished at the time of the family's arrest. A ritual involving 12 bound essences, presumably the missing victims, intended to anchor the lineage into permanence. The room contained 12 stone seats arranged in a circle, each marked with spirals matching the ledger symbols. In the center, a large copper basin etched with hundreds of scratch-like carvings, some resembling names, others resembling screams. No one knows what the Hartwicks planned to pour into that basin. No one wants to. The state bricked over the doorway and never reopened it. But old locals say the ground still sinks in that area every few years as if something below shifts, adjusting, breathing, waiting. And if you've been paying attention, you understand why. Because the Hartwicks didn't see death as an ending. They saw it as preparation. And some doors, once opened, never truly close. After the property was sealed, the state tried to bury the case under layers of bureaucracy, but something leaked. A young surveyor, assigned to map the region decades later, reported an anomaly in the soil conductivity above the bricked-up basement. He described it as electrical breathing. Instruments flickered when placed near the Hartwick grounds, compasses drifted, and even digital recorders produced a faint rhythmic hum, matching the unbinding hymn the journals referenced. Scientists blamed mineral deposits, but the pattern was too specific, too intentional. It behaved less like geology and more like memory, as if the rituals had soaked into the earth itself. No one knows how energy from human suffering embeds into soil, but men have always sensed it: battlefields, prisons, old hospitals. The land remembers what people want to forget. And the Hartwick land remembers everything. Even now, when storms roll through the valley, the rain seems to fall harder on the funeral home than anywhere else, as if the sky recognizes what sleeps beneath. Call it physics, call it trauma resonance, call it something ancient we don't have the language for. But you feel it, don't you? That quiet pressure in the chest. That sense that not everything down there is finished. Historians still argue over the family's final writings, especially the fragmented pages from the patriarch, Abram Hartwick. His handwriting degraded near the end, Letters stretched, slanted, almost frantic, but the ideas became disturbingly coherent. He spoke of the echo, a concept describing the residue left behind when a person's will is stripped away. Not a ghost, not a spirit, something colder. A psychological imprint capable of interacting with the living through influence, not apparition. According to him, the 12 victims weren't sacrifices. They were anchors, vessels meant to hold the echo long after the family was gone. That suggests the Hartwicks believed identity could be broken down, separated from the individual, and woven into a structure. A collective mind. A continuity. Modern psychology calls this imprinting. Occult historians call it binding. Physicists call it nonsense. But the convergence of ideas should make you uneasy because when multiple disciplines brush against the same concept from different angles, it usually means there's something real beneath the myth. Something quietly accepted yet never spoken aloud. Abram claimed, "We will continue through the echo. We will continue because the echo does not age." If you listen closely to certain stories in American history, you'll find he wasn't the only one who believed that. Local authorities eventually attempted to relocate the 12 stone chairs discovered in the basement, but every effort failed. Chains snapped. Pulleys jammed. Machinery overheated. Workers quit mid-shift claiming they felt watched, though the room was empty and sealed. One man said the air felt thick, like someone was thinking inside it. Another said he heard whispers behind him, but when he turned, the sound continued, right beside his ear. None of this was recorded officially, too unbelievable, too career-ending, but the testimony circulated quietly among state workers for years. The prevailing theory wasn't that the stones were supernatural. It was that prolonged exposure to environments built on ritual trauma can disrupt perception in measurable ways. Fear can bend cognition. Architecture can imprint behavior. Spaces can manipulate the mind. That's a psychological fact, proven in prisons, sensory deprivation rooms, and old asylums. And if a room constructed for 12 planned deaths doesn't qualify as a site capable of warping perception, nothing does. Whether anything truly lived in that basement is irrelevant. What matters is this: the room behaved as if it had a will. And that will resisted anyone trying to dismantle it. Decades later, new homeowners tried to build on the land, unaware of the history. The foundation crew lasted 2 days before refusing to continue. They claimed their tools vibrated in their hands, that every stake they drove into the ground felt like they were hammering into something hollow. One worker, who later refused to talk further, said that the soil moved. Not shifted like loose dirt, but pulsed as if responding to pressure. When a small portion of the old basement wall was accidentally exposed, the concrete around it cracked in a perfect spiral, radiating outward like a signature. Engineers blamed frost heave. But frost heave doesn't form symbols. Frost heave doesn't stop perfectly at the edge of the old funeral home footprint. And frost heave doesn't make grown men walk off a site without collecting their pay. After the crew quit, the owners abandoned the project entirely and sold the land at a loss. The property is still empty today. Realtors say it's cursed. Officials say it's contaminated. Locals say something old is sleeping there. But you've been following long enough to understand the truth. Places touched by obsession don't let go easily. As the state archives slowly digitized their older collections, a curious document surfaced. An unsigned letter, dated 1847, written by someone who claimed to be a surviving Hartwick. The language was refined but cold, almost clinical. The writer referenced the work that was interrupted, and insisted the family had not been annihilated, merely reduced. He wrote that the lineage was alive in ways unmeasured by crude instruments. What disturbed archivists most was the final line: a lineage is not a bloodline. It is a pattern. Patterns don't die. They reproduce. They migrate. They infest new minds. If the Hartwicks truly believed identity could be harvested, reshaped, and projected into others, then perhaps they didn't see themselves as a family at all. They saw themselves as a template, an idea meant to survive through influence rather than biology. And if even a fraction of their doctrines slipped quietly into other groups, other institutions, other belief systems, then the Hartwick ideology never ended. It simply changed hosts. Every culture has legends of places where the boundary between the living and the dead feels thin, but the Hartwick property occupies a different category. It's not a ghost story. It's not folklore. It's a case study in how extreme belief, repeated practices, and human suffering can converge to create an environment that behaves like a living intelligence. Investigators who reviewed the site decades later noticed something strange. The more time spent near the old funeral home, the more people reported vivid dreams. Not of ghosts or monsters, but of being watched, observed, evaluated. As if the place wasn't trying to scare them, it was trying to understand them. Dream analysis suggests such visions occur when a person's subconscious attempts to process an external threat. But what external threat? The house was empty. The basement sealed. The family long dead. Yet multiple men across multiple decades experienced the same dream, standing in the 12-stone circle, unable to move, while something just beyond sight leaned in, assessing them. Dreams don't synchronize by accident. Something about that land retains intention. By now, you're beginning to see why the state never turned the property into a historical site. Some truths aren't suppressed to protect the past, they're suppressed to protect the present. Exposing what the Hartwicks attempted would raise questions institutions don't want asked. Questions about how belief can override morality, how identity can be manipulated, how certain groups can reshape perception to control populations. Because the Hartwicks were a small, primitive version of a pattern that repeats across history. A group discovers a dark idea, believes it grants power, and begins reshaping human beings into tools to sustain that power. Whether through ritual, ideology, or psychology, the outcome is the same: people become raw material. And the ones who master the method become nearly impossible to stop. That's why the Hartwick lineage matters. Not because of what they did in 1823, but because they revealed something institutions hide even today. Once a group learns how to dismantle identity, they can build anything in its place. A classified addendum surfaced briefly in the 1970s, later buried again, describing a final sealed item found in the funeral home's basement. A wooden box reinforced with iron bands, locked from the inside. Inside was a stack of letters written by multiple hands, victims judging by handwriting analysis. The letters weren't pleas for help. They weren't confessions. They were affirmations, statements of surrender, declarations that they accepted the transition. Some even expressed gratitude. At first, analysts suspected coercion. But the tone was eerily calm, almost serene. It suggested that the victims weren't merely physically restrained, they were emotionally conditioned. The Hartwicks didn't just take lives. They reshaped minds first. That is the most unsettling part of the entire case. The idea that a person can be convinced to embrace their own erasure if the right psychological levers are pulled. That's not supernatural. That's not folklore. That's human vulnerability weaponized. And it should terrify you more than any ghost story ever could. In the end, the question isn't whether the Hartwicks succeeded in their final experiment. The question is whether they needed to. Their methods, their ideology, their manipulation techniques, these have echoed through other groups, other eras, other systems that treat humans as components rather than individuals. Influence is a contagion. Once an idea takes root in the human mind, it can persist long after the original source has died. That's how the Hartwicks lived on, not through blood but through adoption, through imitation, through anyone who sees identity as clay and other people as vessels. And that's why you're here listening, descending into this forbidden history. Not because you want entertainment, but because deep down you recognize the pattern. You've seen echoes of it in institutions, leaders, movements, even in people close to you. And you can sense that the Hartwick doctrine wasn't the beginning. It was a symptom. So here's the truth men rarely confront. Darkness survives not through monsters but through methods. The Hartwicks were only one expression of a pattern that still thrives today. The belief that identity is malleable, that minds can be rewritten, that people can be harvested for purpose. Whether through ritual, ideology, or subtle psychological conditioning, the mechanism remains the same. Their funeral home is long gone, but their blueprint lingers in systems that shape behavior, in institutions that rewrite perception, in narratives designed to keep you compliant, asleep, unaware. And now you've seen the pattern clearly. You've followed it from bones to journals to rituals to echoes. Once knowledge like this enters you, it doesn't leave. It sharpens you. It wakes you up. It makes you immune to manipulation. And that's exactly why people were never meant to hear it. But you did. And now you carry the one thing the Hartwicks feared most: awareness. Awareness breaks patterns. Awareness destroys control. Awareness ends lineages built on stolen identity. So walk away from this with your eyes open. Because once a man sees the machinery behind the world, he can never be controlled the same way again.